Hello, class. Welcome to macroeconomics. In this particular case, we're going to talk about macroeconomics versus microeconomics. Macroeconomics is big picture, aggregate, and microeconomics are things like monopolies and oligopolies that probably a lot of you have already taken microeconomics. We're going to talk about why economics is important. It's important because it affects your lives or understanding for your businesses, your standard of living, and how we allocate resources and deal with scarcity. Uh, Also, the opportunity costs. Again, assuming you've taken microeconomics, you should understand what that is. We'll talk about it again. Trade, which is not something that's in microeconomics, trade between countries, or it can even be individuals, but in this case, we're talking about trades between, say, Canada and other countries in the world. Uh, we're going to talk about the three fundamental questions of societies and different ways that economic societies can be organized. We're going to talk about something called the production possibilities curve and how we allocate between different products like wheat and butter. We're going to talk about efficiency and unemployment and why economic goals can be challenging to achieve. So the perhaps controversies is how much growth should we have? Too much growth can cause inflation, and it's not necessarily good to have too much growth, just like it's not good to have no growth. The capitalist system is based on growth, but there's a balance or a trade-off. So we also will talk about income redistribution, which has always been a question. This has to do with the wealthy and whether they and how much perhaps that some of their wealth is redistributed to people who are less well off. We'll talk about road pricing and globalization, which I think you're well aware of about the global economy these days. We're going to try and make it the economics more of a scientific method. In other words, be able to prove it and how it operates and be able to prove that not just say this is the way it works, but actually be able to demonstrate that. We also have positive statements that can be backed up with empirical data, which is numbers. So if you say that you have the highest mark in the class, we can prove whether you have the highest mark in the class. Normative statement would be, I'm doing well in class. Well, I've had students get a B in a course, and one student was thrilled that they got a B in the particular course. And another student who got the exact same letter grade, they got a B in a course, was very upset that they didn't get an A. So each one of you has your own standards. So in this particular case, you can pause the recording and look this over. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these types of slides. Whether they're a positive statement or a normative statement. One thing I will say about the bottom one, when I present this in class, some students say that should be a normative statement. But what you can do is you can go to companies that do export and ask them if their exports have increased. So if exports have increased to the Philippines or India or United States, then that probably means you're going to have to hire more people. So that's why they would create more jobs. So this is just how you would test, set up the hypothesis, define the terms, test the hypothesis by gathering information, either accept, reject, or modify the theory. Macroeconomics is big picture. We're dealing with unemployment rates, inflation, government policies, and interest rates. Microeconomics, again, has to deal with oligopolies, perfect competition, monopolies, etc. So here's a slide comparing the two. Macroeconomics is just the overall picture, not the detail. So it's national income versus the income of either a profession or particular type of industry. So here again is a little testing your understanding. So you'd have to say, is this basically the total, or are these the individual components? I think this one should be fairly straightforward. And by the way, if you're confused, I refer you to your textbook or ask your instructor. Factors of production are your inputs. Scarcity, I think we know what that is. It means you don't have enough. You have to share or allocate. Labor is you and I, our mental and physical efforts. Land should be fairly straightforward and fairly clear. Capital are the tools and equipment. So if you have a machine in a business that helps that business operate, that would be capital. And enterprise is entrepreneurial spirit. Some people have it and some people do not. So if you want to go out and start your own business, you would have to be an entrepreneur. And if you want to go to work for that person, you would be labor. Not everybody has an entrepreneurial spirit, and that's fine. We don't need everybody to be entrepreneurs. The earnings or the the reasons why people do labor is they get wages, which is also the same as salaries. For land, they call it rent for the use of the land, the costs in this case, the income, sorry. The capital is interest. And of course, entrepreneurs expect to make a profit. We have different technologies for making things. This is constantly evolving. Opportunity cost is the next best alternative. So what you would be doing if you were not listening to this recording is the next best alternative. So if you weren't listening to this recording, if you're watching a hockey game, a soccer game, a movie, whatever the case may be, that's your next best alternative. Scarcity is fairly straightforward, I would think. We don't have enough. You have to make choices. One thing we all have scarcity of is our time. And so we make choices, and then there's always an opportunity cost. You never have enough time. Consumer goods are, there'll be an example coming up about what consumers buy, like blue jeans, dresses, running shoes, things along that line. Capital goods are the equipment and the factories used to make consumer goods. They can also, in some cases, make other capital goods, but it's not to the end user. Now, some of these can be both. And again, you can pause the recording if you want to have a moment to determine if it's consumer, capital, or both. I think a lot of them are probably fairly straightforward. I don't know anybody who personally owns a jackhammer. Cigarettes are for consumers, etc. E is both, because businesses have hammers, and probably a lot of you at home have hammers. So, and again, if you want some reference, I will refer you to the textbook, or once again, talk to your econ instructor. Labor, capital, land, and enterprise. Again, a lot of these should hopefully be fairly clear or straightforward as to where they are from. So comes to efficiency, we want to be efficient. In the very top line, we have 3 units of labor, 1 unit of capital, and 6 pieces of lumber to make 3 tables. The second line down is inefficient because the capital and the lumber do not change, nor does the output on tables, but now you have 4 people, whereas before you had 3 people. So that is an increase to cost, and it's a waste of one person's time and efforts. The third line down is also inefficient because all of the inputs stay the same, and you have only 2 tables produced, so you're producing 1 less table. The fourth line down could be inefficient, or it could be very efficient, because it just is a change. Rather than having 1 piece of equipment, capital equipment, you have 2, and you only need 2 people. You still have the same amount of raw materials of lumber, and you produce 3 tables. So that it might even be better than the first one. We'd have to look at the costing, but you still have the same output, but you have a different way of doing it. So an example would be, rather you need to dig a hole, you could get a shovel, you could dig a hole. That would be one way to do it, or you could hire a backhoe. Now, it probably depends on your cost and your time and how big the hole is. If it's a small little hole, you probably just use a shovel. Again, we want to be at the lowest point of the average cost curve. We also want to allocate to consumers the best. So it's not like if we have a limited amount, which we do, we don't want it all to go to one place and then nobody else gets any, and the place that the goods went to has too much and it's a waste. So bananas, we don't, one person doesn't go and buy all the bananas and then they've got way too much or doesn't get allocated to them, and then the bananas go bad and other people who want bananas don't have any. So that's what allocative efficiency is. How it's allocated can simply be first come, first serve. A lottery, which is what Ticketmaster often does with Adele tickets, Taylor Swift, etc. They'll have a lottery system. Seller's preferences can actually get you in a lot of trouble because you can be proven to be biased. So with a tight housing rental market, the power is with the seller and who they, it's not so much sometimes who they rent to, but it's who they don't rent to. People can get very upset and claim, bias or, it's not fair. Government decree, government will decide, and of course the market based on price. In this particular case, trade is voluntary. So I will trade you this for something that I don't have that you have, and you have maybe too much of, and you will trade back. So again, Canada produces a lot of things that some other countries want, such as lumber. We export that. The other country can trade back, again, like say oranges or things that we don't necessarily have a lot of, or as enough that we want. You have 2 jurisdictions, Athens and Sparta. They can either make plows or bread. And with no trade, they can produce half of each item. So Sparta will produce 5 bread and 10 plows in the bottom table. And Athens will produce 10 bread and 5 plows, and they'll each have 15 breads and 15 plows. But if there's trade involved, you can see that Athens, which is very good at making bread, Sparta, which is good at making plows, they can have 20 of each. So rather than 15 and 15, which is 30, you have 20 and 20, which is 40. So there's 10 extra units, 5 extra units of bread and 5 extra plows. Economic questions, what to produce, and again, the trade-off between capital goods or consumer goods. We need to have capital goods, otherwise our equipment and technology will fall behind. We can't just produce only consumer goods. And again, the difference between necessities and luxuries. So like, public housing, low income housing, and then you have luxuries, which would be like a mansion. So it depends on, the people who are more well off want the luxuries, tend to, and the people who are less well off need necessities like housing, how we're going to produce it, what technologies we're going to use, and then for whom the goods should be distributed, which is a major economic question. And there's not necessarily a right answer on this. For point number 3, it depends on your personal beliefs. You have foraging societies, which are cooperatives. There's some of these still in Canada. Can be some places that are more remote, or where there's a group of people that have decided that they're going to combine their wealth. You have totalitarian states where there is a centralized or command decisions. The central will determine how much should be made of each particular product. It tends to be a very poor economic system because it tends to get it wrong. So they'll make too much of something and they'll not enough of something. So then you have shortages and then you have surpluses. Traditional and religious societies, which some of you may be very familiar with. And then, of course, competitive or economic market economies, which is often based on price, but most countries are a combination. I don't know that we do too much of point number 2 in Canada. Would be circumstances or specific, very limited times where central planning would determine how much should be made of a particular product. We're trying to have full employment. That's good because some people have income. It also means that those people are producing the maximum amount. So there's less shortages. In fact, there'll be more product made, so there'll be more for everybody. We're going to try and use the best technology that will lower the costs, and we want to use the best production methods. So here's a table of cars and wheat, and you can make 0 cars but make 100 wheat, and you can make 0 wheat and 150 cars. So this just summarizes the table. We turn it into a graph, and you can see that A through F, the dots, are the production possibilities curve. That's where we want to be. Any combination on there is the maximum we can attain. The solid dot that says attainable is not efficient, because that means we're producing less than we could be. So that means we could do better. The solid dot that's labeled X is unattainable. We don't have enough people and technology to make that quantity. So anything that's on the line, A through F, is good. The question then becomes, what's the trade-off? Do we make all cars and no wheat, or all wheat and no cars, or any combination? So again, it's represented, scarcity is represented by points outside the curve. We'd like to have more cars, more wheat. And again, the trade-off of choice is along the line. And opportunity cost is the downward sloping part of it. The costs increase, and there's going to be a graph coming up that will perhaps identify this better than just the words. So in this particular case, when you go from point B to point C, you have 95 units of wheat at point B. You have 50 units of cars. So 95 units of wheat, 50 cars. If you go to C, you're going to have less wheat. You're going to give up 10 units of wheat, but you're going to gain 40 cars. You go from 50 to 90 for the cars, and you go from 95 to 85 for the wheat. When you go from C to D, you're going to gain 30 cars, but you're going to give up 20 units of wheat. So you're going to go from 85 to 65 units of wheat, but you're only going to gain 30 cars. So you have to give up more to gain less. That's why it's declining. So we want to produce on the line. And I do suggest you learn how to read the graphs rather than memorizing the graphs. So in this particular case, if we produce 1,000 units of butter, we're going to have 400 units of guns. So you just read up 1,000 units of butter, which is the x-axis, up to the y-axis, which is point B, 400 units of guns. That's it, right? And if we go from B to C, you're going to gain 1,000 units of butter, from 1,000 to 2,000, but you're going to lose 100 guns. You go from 400 to 300. And then again, you go from C to D, from 2,000 to 3,000 butter, which is a gain of 1,000, but you have to give up 150 guns from 300 to 150. So 400 guns. And again, that's your diminishing returns. The whole line or production possibilities curve can shift out. This is often done when, say, the simplest is the population grows. We have more people, so we can produce more cars, and more people, some of them will produce wheat. So the whole line can shift out if there's an increase to the population. In this particular case, a change in technology only shifts really one of the lines. So you have to be careful how you read this. So if there is a way to improve the technology in cars, new equipment, new technology comes along. So we can produce more cars. We can go from A to either B, C, or D, but you may notice that it doesn't affect the wheat at the y-axis. And so in this particular case, it swings out. It's like a door. When you open a door, the door can swing out, but where the hinge is, that doesn't change. Like it's bolted to the wall. And so it's the same kind of thing in this particular case. It will affect everything except the y-axis. In this case, the y-axis is wheat. Here's some examples. Here's some numeric examples. We're going to do the same thing. So here's our original production possibilities curve 1. There's going to be an increase in the technology for tools. So what it'll do is it'll swing or increase the production possibilities curve outwards, except for point A. So B, C, and D will go out, but there'll be no A2. So here's the original line. And then there's B2, C2, and D2, but there's no A2. And so we have a new production possibilities curve 2, but it does not affect if you produce grain only. The reason why it affects the others is you can produce more tools, and some of that can be reallocated to grain. But if you're only making grain, a change in technology in to produce tools has no effect because you're not making any. All right. So some of the goals that we have is to improve the standard of living. The way that people live today is higher than it was 50 or 100 years ago, and it hopefully will be higher in 50 and 100 years from now. We want economic growth, which helps improve the standard of living. People want more, and we are able to produce more, and in some cases at a lower cost because we have technology, we have computers, and these days the big conversation about AI. If it helps produce economic growth, then that's great. People who want to work are employed, and then they can make things for society. So there's more for everybody. We want stable prices. There's a country I was reading about recently, and they have 124% inflation, which is not good. Prices more than double every year. The Bank of Canada has a target of 2 to 3%, and in September of 2023, when I'm recording this, inflation in Canada is 3.3%. So it's above where they want it to be. But we want stable prices. We do not want prices to double overnight. We want a balance of trade that is viable, so sustainable. So we want to, when you import something, the money goes out of the country. And when you export some a product or a service, money comes into the country. We want that to be sustainable. The equitable distribution of income is a very controversial point. Again, how much should the wealthy people share with the people who are less wealthy? And that's a point for that's politics and even in economics. Depends on your personal points of view with that. Again, managing government debt and deficits. So we're going to see a number of graphs here looking at standards of living. Standard of living in Canada has gone up. Real income, by the way, is you take the nominal amount and you subtract inflation to get the real amount. So if you have a 5% raise and inflation is 3%, you really gain 2. That's what this looks at. So this standard of living has gone up in Canada substantially over the years. You look at improved standard of living. Canada rates at this in 2019, we were considered to be 3rd based on real income based on US dollars. In the world, we ranked as the 21st country in the world. The United States was 7th, but we were better than Italy, which is 28th, etc. So we had a higher standard of living, and some of you may come from some of these countries. And you can, maybe even one of the reasons why you came to Canada is for your education and also maybe the standard of living. See, Switzerland ranks very high. Right. Also, the differences in the growth rates. You know this from business math. If you have a 1.2% growth rate, you can see it's the bottom line, 2.2, you go from 31,000 to 55. And if you increase to 3.2 because of the compounding effect, it then becomes 134,000. And the economic growth, Canada ranked second in 2019 at 1.7. This is of the G7, which is 7 of the largest industrialized countries in the Western world. And you can see that Canada's growth rate was behind the United States. We're 1.7, US was 2.3. We're certainly behind China for growth, but China started from a smaller number. So Canada ranked 140th in the world for growth, which may or may not be a good thing. In the G7, we are second. We're slightly ahead of France, etc. Right. Fifth, when it came to full employment. So we could certainly be doing a better job of making sure that people have jobs, again, if they want. And we will talk about different types of unemployment in upcoming chapters. In this particular case, stable prices, we ranked last as far as the inflation rate in 2019 and 80th in the world. Now, like I said, in 2023, fall of 2023, we have 3.3, but the other countries have generally had higher inflation than because of the COVID pandemic. Imports have exceeded exports over the last 10 years, which also means that more money is going out of the country than is coming in. You can see that for many years, Canada gained in that regard, and then around 2010, it changed. Pay attention to the trade deficit, which is the gap between the lines. This again has to do with how well we distribute our income between the wealthy. What percentage have most amount of money or income? You can see that Canada ranks 5th in the G7 when it comes to distributing income between the top 20% and the bottom 20%. You can see the United States, there's a greater disparity between the rich and the poor. That's on a worldwide basis, the United States is ranked 74th. So that means there's the people who are rich are very rich and the people who are poor are very poor. And Canada does a more even, and now whether you agree with that or not, we spread out the wealth more evenly than the Americans do. That's what this represents. Not as well as, say, Japan or Germany, but better than Italy and some of the other countries you see. As far as government deficits, again, 2019, Canada has small percentage deficit. The United States was worse at -4%. So that means they spent, for every dollar, the Americans spent $104. For every dollar, Canada spent 0.3%. So more than what we got. Italy and Germany had surpluses. Macroeconomic tools, the fiscal policy, which we'll definitely talk about in upcoming chapters, our taxing and government spending, monetary policy, our interest rates on the money supply, and direct controls are things like tariffs and minimum wages and other regulations. I'm not going to go through and read this. This is something for you to review. Make sure you understand these points when you are studying for your tests. If your instructor has turned on the Smart Book, you can do practice questions to test your knowledge. So this is just a summary of the important points of the chapter.